Now, it's a bit of a cliche to call people unpredictable, but I genuinely think that could not apply more to the person I'm interviewing today, Peter Oborne. Now, Peter Oborne, he's a Conservative, he's on the right, he's a former chief political correspondent for The Telegraph. But wait till you see him. He's, as I say, an unpredictable guy, fascinating, someone I read absolutely avidly. So let's go to the People's Republic of Chiswick and have a chat with Peter Oborne. You're Conservative. Jeremy Corbyn certainly is not. But you've been remarkably sympathetic about Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, what's your overall view?
I think he's a real breath of fresh air. I really admire him. I think he's a profoundly British figure.
In what sense?
There's a great book by A.J.P. Taylor called The Troublemakers, and it's about the dissident tradition in British foreign policy making. And it traces it back to Tom Paine, Bright, Keir Hardie, and Lansbury. He's clearly in that, purely in that tradition. Hostile, radical, hostile to the establishment policy machine. Until he arrived, there was this consensus shared by the media and by the main political parties that the political opposition was abolished. The task of an opposition was to resemble the government as much as it could. And to actually have a man who believes a party which doesn't have to agree automatically with the government of the day is incredible, it's glorious. And so all I'm trying to do is to write about him fairly and also celebrate him in a way. I mean, I think that we will look back on Mr. Corbyn as a wonderful change to a political system which had got completely atrophied and ceased really to represent the British people.
Do you think he's being unfairly attacked, even smeared at the moment?
And there's a collaboration between the mainstream media and the Conservative Party and the massive of Labour MPs to make a whole series, to distort anything intelligent which Mr. Corbyn says. It's such an outrage.
Why are they trashing him?
I think there are two things. One is the herd mentality of the kind of Westminster media. I think that Mr. Corbyn does challenge the system. The people who run the show are big business in terms of domestic policy, and the Americans in terms of foreign policy. The dissidence is not really tolerated, and if you can look how effective the system is, just think about the people who opposed the Iraq War, see how they did, and people who were in favour of the Iraq War, you know, they're still running the show.
Yeah.
And so there's no punishment. Penitence. Yeah, there's no penitence, no punishment. And Jeremy Corbyn, well, I know he's made a lot of mistakes, but I think his foreign policy stuff is fascinating. Let's remember, he was right about Iraq. More recently, he was right about Libya. He was only one about 12 or 13, I think, MPs voted against the Libya debacle. And that's been really probably as great a phenomenal failure as Iraq in its own way.
And yet rarely spoken about.
I mean, at the moment, as we're talking, ISIS are kind of going to be marching on Benghazi. I mean, they're just taking one town after another at the moment. Again and again, Jeremy Corbyn has been right about the great foreign policy issues of the day.
You're someone who considers yourself a Conservative, and yet you're anti-establishment. How is it possible to square those two things?
I think that I'm much truer to what conservatism is really about than people who are establishment conservatives. The Conservatives, if you look at it historically, they believe in civil society, they're sceptical of the state, they don't like foreign engagements, they are sceptical of big ideas, and they're very, very sceptical of the whole creation of the great states of the 20th century. And what's odd about the current lot of Conservatives is that they have gone off in a new direction. Actually, the Conservative Party has been captured by an idea which is completely contrary to conservatism, which is neoconservatism, which is really a revolutionary ideology. So you can't feel happy as a traditional Conservative with a political party which has been captured, but is really a foreign American ideology.
David Cameron then, how do you sum up David Cameron? What does he represent to you?
I think he's the most skillful Prime Minister. We've had ministerial Prime Minister, naturally Prime Ministerial. He's got charm, he's got grace, you know, he enjoys it. Whereas Gordon Brown was always sort of seeing plots around every corner and in the depths of gloom, and Tony Blair, quite frankly, by the end had gone slightly bonkers. Cameron has got some significant achievements. I think the attempt to recast the welfare state and bring it back to the vision of Beveridge, which is roughly what Duncan Smith is trying to do. And secondly, to recast the education system and bring back the idea of educational excellence. Foreign affairs, I think Cameron is hopeless, really bad.
I mean, on foreign affairs, this is where often I suppose some of your positions align with what people might expect someone on the left to come up with. Very critical of Western foreign policy. And so, for example, the war in Iraq, that was something you were very passionately against. That war only happened because Conservative MPs supported it. 139 Labour MPs voted against, only about 13 or so.
No, by the way, it's not true. I wasn't passionately against
were you
it.
not?
I was sort of, I was shamefully neutral, yes.
Oh, you were neutral, so I'm wrong. I'm wrong.
But what happened afterwards was horrifying, and the revelations about the scale of the deception which preceded it.
Did that change your views then? Is that
it was absolutely devastating. I mean, Chilcot is going to be a very interesting and big moment, because we were lied to by the British government about the nature of the threat which Saddam Hussein posed. Now, that's in order to make the case for what was an illegal war. And for me, it was a profound moment, because up to that moment I had believed that the British state, British establishment was trustworthy. As a Tory, I would believe that. Ever since then, I have not trusted the state. And and I have become much more sceptical. The war on terror has led to such a series of total spectacular disasters.
What are the great disasters for you of the war on terror?
Well, you look at Iraq. I mean, the consequences of the invasion of Iraq in terms of the Middle East, our failure to understand domestically how important it is to believe in British values, i.e. tolerance, decency, rule of law, our readiness to abandon the rule of law, torture, the emergence in Britain of a sort of soft apartheid towards Muslims.
How do you see the plight of Muslims in Britain today?
The government has constructed a narrative about Islam in Britain which distinguishes between good Muslims, i.e. people who basically become secular, and bad Muslims, those who are devout. I think it's very negligent about anti-Muslim hatred, Muslim bigotry. I think it has invented a new concept called non-violent extremism, which is a kind of word for thought crime.
I mean, does that worry about where this is heading, or do you see any glimmer of hope about?
I think the glimmer of hope, by the way, is that British people are basically decent. In the 1930s, there was an incipient fascism in Britain, but it never developed into the full thing. I guess in time that we will sort ourselves out. But at the moment, it's all heading in the wrong direction.
On foreign policy, you've been very critical of the policies of Israel towards the Palestinian people. In terms of British foreign policy and its attitude towards Israel, you think there's that's being pushed in a certain direction?
British foreign policy, not just, by the way, towards Israel, the whole Middle East is very troublesome. Most recently, we saw an amazing example when the executions took place in Saudi Arabia, and the Foreign Secretary, the first thing he said about them was that they were that they were convicted terrorists. These are people who were arrested as children, some of them mentally unwell. Others have just been clearly peaceful protesters. And so there's our foreign policy in this whole area, there's something very troublesome. And in Israel, where we will not condemn properly the settlements, which are illegal. They are illegal under international law. I mean, it's not a question of an opinion. I mean, they've been repeatedly ruled illegal under international law. So you're giving support to an illegal occupation. Saudi
Arabia is one of the most repressive regimes on earth. It's at the absolute epicenter of international extremism. Why are we so closely allied to that regime, to the extent where David Cameron helped them get on the UN Human Rights Committee?
I once met the head of policy at the Foreign Office a few years ago, and I said to him, explain why it is that we will not have any dealings with Iran. I mean, I'm not saying Iran's a perfect state or anything, and yet we're always on the side of the Saudis. He didn't challenge that. He just simply said 35,000 jobs and oil.
Wow.
We rely much too much on Saudi information. I mean, one of the reasons why our analysis of, say, Assad and Syria has been disastrous, I think we rely on local partners who tell us fibs about what, or tell us very partial versions about what's going on in the region. And that, in a way, that has meant that we're on the side of Al-Qaeda. There's been a British foreign policy alliance with Al-Qaeda.
In what sense, in what material way do you think Britain's been on
Well,
the same side of
it's Al-Nusra, the main opposition group, I mean, it's rebel group in Syria, has been getting all kinds of arms and stuff which have ultimately come from the West. We say we supplied this stuff to the Free Syrian Army, these moderates, but the Free Syrian Army is just a means of getting materials, etc., to al-Nusra.
But isn't it the case that most civilians being killed in Syria are actually not being killed by ISIS or Al-Qaeda, but by the Assad regime?
The Assad regime has killed plenty of civilians and committed plenty of atrocities, but I'd be very, very careful about statistics coming out of Syria.
You were chief political commentator at the Daily Telegraph, and you resigned nearly a year ago now, and it was an explosive resignation over advertising from the Telegraph had advertising from HSBC, and as a result, it wasn't investigating the allegations against HSBC. So you just want to explain how you got to that point, that moment of resignation, in such a dramatic way?
I was sitting on this sofa with Anas Al-Sakriti, who is the chief executive of the Cordoba Foundation. He told me his bank account had been closed down. And I said, what? I really went to work on it. And I discovered that he wasn't just him, it was the Finsbury Park Mosque, the various other leading figures in the Muslim community. All of them had received on the same day in July 2014 this letter from the HSBC closing their bank accounts. I thought it was fascinating. It's like having running water in a house, having a bank account nowadays. I just couldn't get it into the Daily Telegraph, not even online.
Wow.
And then I looked into that, and I could find out that there was a real problem of getting any story which was in any way negative about HSBC into the Daily Telegraph. And at that point I started to raise the issue with the management, and in due course I resigned.
In those moments leading up to that resignation, you must have felt a sense of trepidation, perhaps.
A little bit of trepidation, but actually I was very careful. I didn't say anything which wasn't true. I researched everything which I said very carefully. I was properly prepared. I took legal advice. It was,
And this was no spur of the moment, send an email. This was...
It took about 6 months, yeah.
Wow,
the whole
6 months.
process, yeah.
And it was absolutely clear to you that because of the advertising from HSBC, the Telegraph was deliberately censoring stories about HSBC?
Absolutely. It's a great paper, and it's got all sorts of fabulous things. But I do think, as a point of principle, that newspapers should not allow their coverage to be dictated by advertising or other commercial, particularly advertising considerations.
The European Union, is it a threat to democracy? And also the euro, I suppose, few now would argue it's been anything but a calamity, but...
Yeah, no, I was always against the euro.
Yeah, of course, yeah. You wrote a book called Guilty Men, which made it abundantly clear.
But what the European Union is hostile to democracy. It's an anti-democratic system. And you can see that looking at Portugal, Spain, Greece above all. If Cameron does what he said he'd do in the Bloomberg speech, where he announced the referendum, in other words, if he has a fundamental renegotiation of the redefinition of the terms of British membership, and that we are part of a free trading organisation which we can and retain our ability to make our own laws and run our own country, then of course I would back the Prime Minister. But the signs are that he isn't going to do anything like that, that we are going to remain where we were. The European Union does not actually allow democracy, it's hostile to democracy.
Are you optimistic about the future of democracy in this country?
I'm naturally optimistic about most things, but at the moment, you'd have to be pessimistic. At the moment, there's big struggles ahead to define how democracy works. There's a big forces which we want to abolish democracy in Britain. And that's one of the reasons why I like Mr. Corbyn, because I think he's on, when it comes to that great fight. He's on the side, whatever his detractors say, of democracy.
Brilliant. Cheers, Peter.
Yeah.
Nice one.
Thank
Great.
you, yeah.
You see, what I really like about Peter Oborne is, though, even though he's a Conservative, he's very independent-minded, very fair-minded. He's somebody who is very critical of power and the people who exercise power, which is an all too rare quality in the media. That somebody like him would defend Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. Well, it's novel from anyone in the press, let alone someone on the right. But he has this sense of fairness, and that's what I find so fascinating. Thanks for watching. We've got loads of more interviews, so do click on them. Leave your comments, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.